Hello, my name is Jan Smith, and this is a whistleblower video. This is actually a sequel to my original Psychology and Child Protective Services video. Although this particular one is more than informative, it should be able to assist many who are being unfairly targeted by Child Protective Services begin to gather together others and maybe do a class action lawsuit. This is going to be based on my own personal experiences with chemical dependency counseling in the psychology field, the things that I discovered, the things that I implemented, and basic collaboration with the courts and with other agencies and the outcome. This is really important in terms of understanding how the system works and how it is affecting families and children. So stay tuned, watch the whole thing. It is going to provide you a lot of information that will help you when you are attending courts and when the courts are trying to determine whether or not you're safe for children. Keep in mind that most of the people that you're dealing with could not pass a psychological evaluation themselves. These tests are geared to provide diagnosis, better known as indicators. A series of indicators equals a diagnosis. And we're going to be talking a lot about indicators and how those indicators are used in family courts and in dependency courts. It starts with a history. Here in the state of Washington, I was a chemical dependency counselor for 11 years. I started chemical dependency counseling when if it looked like an alcoholic, if it acted like an alcoholic, then it was an alcoholic. There wasn't a lot of scientific basis for diagnosis. We took a variety of criteria, we put that criteria together, we slapped it into an assessment, we sent it in the court, and the court bought it every single time without question, pretty much. And so the industry in general decided they wanted it to become more scientific. They wanted to use DSM-4 criteria, they wanted to use ASAM criteria, and I'm not going to take the time to really explain those two things, but those can be easily Googled if you're interested in knowing more about what the DSM-4 is and what the ASAM criteria is for chemical dependency counseling. But both of those are tools for being able to place someone appropriately who is under the assessment process, usually by the courts. So up to that point, we didn't use those two diagnostic tools very much, but there came a point when industry-wide they began to insist on it. The courts began to insist on a more scientific diagnosis. Now, I worked for a company in Tacoma, Washington, who didn't want to use those diagnostic tools because those tools didn't break down certain types of criteria well enough to put the people into more advanced treatment modalities. In other words, if you're using the DSM-4 and the ASAM criteria, you might end up putting someone in a 6-month program versus a 2-year program, whereas using the methods we used before, it was very easy to put someone in a 2-year program. So what was happening is I would do an assessment. I was trying to do it by the scientific method, and my supervisor would come in and tear my assessment apart if it didn't land a 1 or a 2-year treatment program. If it landed a 6-month program, or if my assessment landed no program, then he would come in and he would tweak it a little bit, embellish, tweak, add things until it became a 1 or a 2-year program. I had ethical problems with that, and at the same time I was trying to advance into a more scientific modality, and so I racked my brain. I was kind of caught in between a rock and a hard place. It looked like I was either going to get fired, which I couldn't. I was a single parent. Transferring to another agency wasn't really going to work because all the agencies were kind of caught in this transition and doing similar things, plus being very frustrated with this transfer. So I created a modality. I created a diagnostic process where I took the DSM-4 and I would accurately put the correct diagnosis. But then I would add a bunch of indicators and then give the treatment modality, bump it up to a 1 or 2 year program, even though the DSM-4 wouldn't suggest that. But I had enough of a list of indicators that it looked like I had the criteria necessary in order to bump treatment up. And so I began to turn these assessments into the courts. And I sat back and I waited to see what the defense attorneys were going to do. I sat back and waited to see what the judges were going to do, because it was totally unscientific and pretty much fraudulent. And so what I discovered is that not only didn't the defense attorneys not question it and just pushed it through, which they should have, but the judges weren't questioning it either. Why? Because the system is scandalous, it's fraudulent, and it's financially based. So it didn't stop there, though, with me. The rest of the agency took on my strategies. But then as people began to go out and get second opinions, they would have to bring my original assessment. So they took that assessment into other agencies. Other agencies saw what I was doing. They liked what I was doing. They would back my play, and then the next thing I knew, I started seeing assessments from other agencies that on their assessments had the same format I did and was using the same strategies. So not only did I start a fraudulent practice, but everybody else copycatted it, and now it's standard procedure here in the state of Washington to use indicators to bump up treatment, even though they can't justify it through ASAM or they can't justify it through the DSM-4 or 5. Now let's take this over to the field of psychology, because psychology is very similar in how they are approaching things in the dependency courts and actually in family courts in general. If they can't get a diagnosis, they're using indicators. Now, what does that mean? It means that for every diagnosis, there has to be a certain number of indicators. Like, say, for example, bipolar maybe has 4 or 5 indicators, list of things that would fit the bipolar description in order to be labeled bipolar. But let's say you do an assessment and you take some tests and you only have 2 or 3, but you don't have the necessarily 4 or 5. So what Child Protective Services is doing is they're using those indicators as though they are actual diagnosis. And they're destroying families using indicators. Now, as I said at the very beginning of this video, there's not a single one of them that could take this test if they were to answer the questions honestly that wouldn't also end up with a score of indicators. Now, what are you going to do with all these people with indicators? Are you going to take all of their children and sell them to the highest bidder? Well, you can't, because there's not a single one of them that could take these tests and not have indicators, and probably quite a few indicators of various different diagnosis and personality disorders. So here you have it. You have an agency and you have prosecutors that are now unethically taking indicators in the field of psychology, and they're using it unscientifically. And the defense attorneys are not questioning it. The judges are not questioning it. The CASA workers are not questioning it. And they're pushing these false diagnoses through the system, and they're making them work, and they are taking people's children and they are labeling people for life. These things don't go away. They're labeling people for life using unscientific methods and then selling their children to strangers. So we need to put a stop to this practice. We need to also put a stop to the practice of how they are treating people with disabilities. If someone has a learning disability, the caseworkers can't seem to snatch up their children fast enough and market them to the highest bidder. So we have a problem in this country with that. I don't think there's any other country that's quite as severe in the discrimination of parents with disabilities as this one. This one is really acting severely against people with disabilities of all types and varieties. People coming back from war, who are coming back with post-traumatic stress disorders. They come back from having gone through extreme, horrible circumstances, only to have our own government take their children and sell them and make sure that they can never see them again. This is unfortunate, and it needs to stop, and the vets need to get together and do something about this. They're using indicators. Again, if you have any signs of PTSD whatsoever, they're going to label you PTSD, and then they're going to use that as a basis for taking and selling children. Now, language, of course, is a very critical component to selling the general public on some of these human and civil rights violations. They use a lot of flowery language. They make things sound warm and fuzzy. They kind of smooth over the rough edges of what it really means to have government agents come in and snatch up children and disrupt a family and put them in strangers' homes. They're not really letting the public know just how traumatic this really is, especially if you've got armed police walking in the door and they've got their guns pointed and they're having to rough up dad, or they're throwing mom on the couch and they're snatching up these children roughly and they're dragging them out the door kicking and screaming. You know, these aren't the images that the state is putting up on the screen for the general public to see. They don't see the drama and the trauma that's left from the damage that is done from destroying a family. But what they do with the end result, if mom or dad go through depression, they will use that against them in a court of law. Now understand that they are using it wrongly because it's situational depression, and they will make a big deal out of this situational depression, and they will call it permanent, or they will indicate that it's permanent, and therefore use that situational depression against people. You also have them doing what I did. They use indicators. If they don't have a diagnosis, they will embellish life history in such a way as to paint it negatively. So you have these caseworkers that call up these psychologists, and one of them just finally admitted it, and there's a lawsuit in another state, not here in the state of Washington, where the psychologist admitted that they gave a diagnosis that the caseworker wanted. Well, this goes on all the time and in every state. You've got the caseworker who contacts the psychologist first, lets the psychologist know what it is that they want from the psychologist, and then the whole entire assessment process from that point on ends up going in favor of the prosecution. Now, people need to stop allowing this to happen, and how they stop it is by insisting on collateral witnesses of their own, by filling out their own confidentiality statements where they don't allow hearsay to be brought into the assessor. And when the judges start demanding 3, 4, 5 psych evals until one comes through that works for the prosecution, that needs to go to the state auditor's office. That's called duplication of services. Duplication of services is fraud. Okay, so when you've got some idiot judge or some idiot prosecutor insisting on one assessment after another assessment after another assessment because they don't like the fact it's positive, and they're trying to find that one assessment provider who will, embellish and dig up some dirt and maybe lie a little bit on the assessment until the prosecution has what they need to sell the children. And that's exactly what they're doing. And they can sit there and say that they're not marketing children. They can say that they're, they spend billions and billions of dollars in this country marketing foster children and trying to get strangers to adopt them. It is a racket, and psychology is being used unethically, unscientifically in these dependency courts and in family courts to do this exact act. I'm going to ask you to send this video to your DSHS office, to your legislators, to the people who are the decision makers in your state, to the family courts who are engaging in these practices, these unethical practices, the ones who are writing the court rules, which would include your state Supreme Court, because they are writing rules that give these professionals almost godlike qualities where they can say nothing wrong, even if they can't back up what they are diagnosing. They're still giving them the leeway in the court rules. That needs to change. So understand what your rights are. You have the right to refuse a psych eval. If you choose to do a psych eval, you have a right to your paperwork. If they refuse you paperwork, if they refuse to give you your assessment, do not do the psych eval. You cannot defend yourself when you don't have a copy of it. If you have a defense attorney that's refusing to give you the paperwork, then you need to file complaints on them. If you have a judge that's demanding several psych evals, file a complaint against them. File a complaint with the local judicial board, and also file a complaint with the state auditor, because what they're doing is duplication of services. They are fishing for the right diagnosis. It's not any different than judge fishing. If you're going to go into court and you don't want a certain judge, and so you work it out to where you get the right judge, that's illegal. You're not supposed to be able to do that. But that's what they're doing with assessments. They are fishing for a certain diagnosis that will help them traffic children. So these are just a few suggestions that I'm hoping will help you in terms of understanding how they're using these assessments and the illegalities of those assessments. Psychology in the courtroom is no longer a healing art. It is a prosecution tool. And when you go in to do an assessment, they're not interested in helping you. They're not your friend. They're not trying to make a determination as to how they can help you and your family. They are looking for dirt, and they will get that dirt. If they have to embellish, make it up, add to it, use every bit of hearsay they can, false diagnosis, you name it, they're going to do it. And so protect yourself. Don't allow them to continue to destroy your families this way. Thank you.